So class, we're going to talk about the Chapter 24 material today on how human beings interact with the ecosystem and how it benefits and potentially harms us. Now there are some terms that we need to define right from the get-go. One of which is ecosystem. Our ecosystem is defined as somewhere where an organism can interact with each other. Generally speaking, the ecosystem is going to have living and non-living components, biotic and abiotic components. And we can break our ecosystems up into the parts that we as humans enjoy. That's terrestrial ecosystems, because we live on land. And then there's also going to be the aquatic ecosystem. When we look at aquatic ecosystems or in-water ecosystems, most of those are going to be marine. And when we use that term marine, we're referring to saltwater ecosystems. If we look at our planet, there's a certain shell or a certain area on planet Earth where living things can exist. We can find living bacterium miles up into the atmosphere, and we found living bacteria deep down into the Earth's bedrock. And from up into the atmosphere to deep down in the bedrock, and everything in between, that circle that can hold any living thing on Earth is called the biosphere. We typically find bacterium or archaeum on the extreme edges of the biosphere. We as human beings like to live right in the middle of the biosphere, where there's the happy medium or the ideal conditions for most forms of life. As we look at our land-based or terrestrial ecosystems, we're going to have forested and grassland-based ecosystems. As the name implies, a forest ecosystem has a lot of trees. It's going to be dominated by trees. And there's multiple kinds of forest ecosystems. We can have a tropical or a temperate rainforest. We could have a coniferous forest. We could have a temperate deciduous forest. Rainforests in general have very high rainfall or high precipitation totals every single year. Tropical ones are near the equator and have consistently warm weather. A good example of a tropical rainforest would be the Amazon rainforest. A temperate rainforest is a little bit more esoteric. Not many people are aware of temperate rainforests. They exist at either 40 north or 40 south degrees latitude, and they're going to still have the consistently high rainfall, but they aren't necessarily going to have the consistently high temperature. Within the United States, we have temperate rainforests in the state of Oregon. That's well known for its temperate rainforest. If we look on the windward side or the west side of the Rocky Mountain Range. Coniferous forests are going to be made of a lot of gymnosperms or evergreen trees. The largest coniferous forest in the planet is known as the taiga. And the taiga is a large forest that produces 20% of the Earth's oxygen. It's the lungs of the planet. And it's the large evergreen forest that makes up much of Russia and much of Canada. And then we can have our temperate deciduous forest. Here in Minnesota, we have lots of temperate deciduous forests. Those are going to be made of hardwood trees or trees that grow slowly. Those could include oak, beech, maple, so on and so forth. We also have here in Minnesota grasslands. These are areas or ecosystems that are dominated by grass as a predominant or most common species. We could have temperate grasslands, which is what we have here in Minnesota, also known as a prairie. Or we could have a tropical grassland. A good example of a tropical grassland would be a savanna, an area that has consistently high temperature. So this first word, tropical, refers to near the equator where there's that consistently high temperature. And then temperate means farther away from the equator. A desert is going to be characterized by a lack of precipitation. And when most people think of a desert, they think of the Savannah Desert or maybe the Gobi Desert. They think of an area that's hot and dry. But the temperature isn't going to be a defining characteristic of a desert. You can have a cold desert. And a cold desert is known as a tundra, because tundras also have an extreme lack of precipitation. Most deserts are going to receive less than 5 inches of rain annually, or less than half an inch of rain per month. So they're going to be quite dry. As we look at our terrestrial ecosystems, we find that there's a lot of variation on our planet. Now, if you're into science fiction and you watch Star Wars or Star Trek, they make it seem like a planet will have all of one specific kind of ecosystem, but that's probably not going to be the case once we're able to travel to another planet. As we can see by the key, that there are many sub-ecosystems or sub-biomes that we can have on our planet. We can have the Mediterranean biome, we can have a savanna, we can have a temperate rainforest, and there are other sub-biomes that we didn't cover in detail in this class. If you want to learn more about these terrestrial biomes, you can go ahead and take ecology. Let's talk about aquatic ecosystems. We have saltwater or marine ecosystems, and then freshwater ecosystems. As we look at our marine or saltwater ecosystems, those include anything directly next to the ocean or on the ocean itself. So we can have the ocean, we can have a seashore, which has some unique features associated with the tidal motions of the ocean. We'll have coral reefs or estuaries. Estuaries are unique in that they're a mix of both fresh and salt water, depending on the time of the day and the movement of the tide. When the tide is going out, estuaries have predominantly fresh water. When the tide is coming in, estuaries have predominantly salt water. And then an in-between stage, it's called brackish water, when it's about half and half fresh and salt water. So if we look at an estuary, because they alternate between fresh and salt water, they have an incredible amount of biodiversity. Within our freshwater ecosystems, we'll have lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, so on and so forth. These, generally speaking, aren't as interesting. There's not as much variation between lakes, rivers, ponds, and streams. And we here in Minnesota have also been exposed to them as we've been growing up, so they probably aren't as new or novel to us. Here in this figure, we can see the open ocean itself, which is characterized by a lack of nutrients, and it's also going to be characterized by very deep water depths. Near the surface, they're still light, but as we travel down into the water, we find that first, red wavelengths of light are absorbed, and then as we continue traveling down through the water, eventually the blue wavelengths of light are absorbed until we reach complete or total darkness. We can also have an estuary. Those estuaries are typically characterized by having the brackish water as the water moves in with the tide and out with the tide. Coral reefs are going to be characterized by coral, and this picture is a little bit deceptive in that it shows bright colors on the coral reefs. Most coral reefs on the planet right now are suffering from widespread bleaching or destruction. And this widespread destruction on most of the coral reefs on our planet are caused primarily by the increasing acidification of the ocean, increased pollutants being dumped into the ocean, and then increased ocean water temperatures. Back in 2009, I went to the 2008. I was in the Bahamas studying coral reefs at the time. And even as recently as 2008, there still was hardly any bright, colorful coral left in the Bahamas. So, if you want to see bright, colorful coral in nature, now's the time to do it because it's rapidly disappearing. I mentioned these two terms briefly already. They are biotic and abiotic. Abiotic means non-living. Now, I want to be very precise or pedantic here right now. I don't mean dead. If something is dead, that implies at one point it was alive. And then it would be a biotic component. These non-living components are going to include things like rocks. And when I say a rock, I mean a non-life form based rock. So something like granite or basalt or obsidian. Or we can include the weather patterns or sunlight concentrations or sunlight levels. These are the non-living components. They never were alive and never will be alive and never were dead. Then we have biotic components. They are either actively living or have recently been living. So if you look at a dead log in the forest floor, that's still going to be considered a biotic component. Within our biotic components, if we look at our active organisms can be broken up in several categories, or currently living organisms. We have autotrophs. Autotrophs are the base of all food chains and food webs. They are the producers. They take abiotic components and make them biotic components. The classic autotroph is a plant. And that plant can take non-living water, non-living carbon dioxide, and non-living sunlight and change that into something that's biotic, a molecule of life, particularly glucose. Unlike the autotrophs, which are producers, our heterotrophs are going to be the consumers. All heterotrophs get their energy from the autotrophs. So our heterotrophs will consume either each other or they will consume those autotrophs. Up until the 1970s, it was thought that all autotrophs relied on sunlight as their ultimate energy source. But in the 1970s and early 1980s, we discovered deep sea thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean that had a completely different kind of ecosystem. And instead of relying on sunlight as the ultimate source of energy, they were relying on volcanic vents as their ultimate source of energy. And instead of using carbon dioxide, they would use nitrogen-containing chemicals that were being released from those volcanic vents. And bacteria were then acting as the baseline producers at the bottom of the ocean. If you're interested in xenobiology or studying alien life or the potential of alien life, right now the best bet we have right now of finding alien life on another planet is with those non-sun-based producers or autotrophs that rely on alternative ways of fixing energy into an organic form. If we look at our heterotrophs or our consumers, we'll have the baseline or bottom level consumers. These guys are going to feed on the primary producers or the autotrophs. So they're going to feed on the plants. I want you to think of these as the cows, the bunny rabbits, the grasshoppers. These are the plant eaters. Carnivores, on the other hand, need to eat another animal. Most carnivores are going to be eating herbivores. And that has to do with energy distributions throughout food webs. However, some carnivores are designed to eat, other carnivores. And we have multiple tiers or trophic levels to our food webs. We also have omnivores as well. We as human beings are omnivores. We are capable of eating producers, we can eat plants, and we can eat other animals as well. We can eat consumers. And then finally, there's detrovores, or detritus feeders. A detrovore, or detritus feeder, is something that eats on dead biotic factors. Or in other words, you can think of these as the decomposers. So when we think of a detritus feeder, think of a mushroom, think of soil bacteria, think of soil fungi. Those are the detritus feeders. Earthworms are another good example of detritus feeders. Regardless of where that organism sits in the food chain and food web, they're all going to have a specific spot that they fit in the ecosystem. And that role, that spot that an organism fits in the ecosystem, is known as the niche. And yes, it's always been pronounced niche, not niche. Although if you say niche, to me it's more of a potato-potato kind of situation. So it depends on which coast you're from, I guess. Each organism has that specific niche, where it interacts in the ecosystem with what biotic components it interacts with and what abiotic components that it interacts with. So here are many different biotic components of the ecosystem. We can have diatomaceous or algae-based producers. We can have large tree-based producers. These are both going to be autotrophs. They take sunlight and combine it with carbon dioxide to make their energy. We can have a carnivore. Here, for example, we have a snake eating a rodent. But then we can have a hawk eating a snake. So we can have a carnivore eating a herbivore, or a carnivore eating another carnivore. If we look at our herbivores, those are going to be organisms, animals, that eat the producers. So we can have a worm or a bunny rabbit eating a plant. And then finally, we can also have our detritus feeders, or detrivores. And these guys are going to decompose. Oftentimes, they're just referred to as our decomposers. Which category is not shown on this screen? We have producers, we have carnivores, we have herbivores, and we have decomposers. What was that, Ashley?
Humans.
What category do we as humans fall into? Omnivore. So we don't have omnivore pictured, so let's go ahead and add a human being. There, now there's an omnivore. And this omnivore even has 2 arms. As we look at the energy flow through the ecosystem, we find that it starts with the producers and then works its way up the ecosystem. We as human beings are primarily concerned with the ecosystems that we interact with. So we're going to be concerned with the ecosystems that have sunlight as the ultimate source of energy. Yes, having life on the bottom of the ocean at the volcanic vents is cool and all, but it doesn't necessarily affect us on the surface very much. So we will say that our energy is ultimately solar energy, because the sun supplies the energy to the producers to power our ecosystems. And as a producer is eaten by an herbivore and an herbivore is eaten by a carnivore, there'll be energy flow, as we'll have carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids and lipids going from one organism to the next organism. This energy flow is specifically going to be the energy contained in the chemical bonds of those organic molecules. Now, a lot of this energy gets wasted. Most of this energy is wasted energy, and it's going to be converted to heat that dissipates into our environment. A very small portion of that energy is actually going to be stored up within the organism, and that can then be passed on to the next generation. We find that we have chemical cycling, so we'll have individual nutrients or vitamins that go from one organism to the next organism, from the atmosphere to the soil, and then back and forth again. These chemicals will be talked about later on, and we'll talk about the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, the phosphorus cycle in more detail. To summarize, we're going to have inorganic nutrients. And these inorganic nutrients can be taken up by producers and combined with energy from the sun to form the bottom of the food chain or the food web. And then there'll be waste heat that's going to be performed by or given off by the producers, and then consumers eat the producers and give off waste heat. And then decomposers will take dead producers and dead consumers and convert them back into inorganic nutrients. And in the process, they give off waste heat. As we look at how food and energy is transferred, we find that we lose a lot of the energy we consume as heat to the environment. We also lose a lot of energy through defecation and urinate or excretion, also known as pooping and peeing. We also lose energy when we die. And then a small fraction of the energy that we consume is going to be maintained within our level of the food chain. Approximately 10%. As we go from one level to the next level in the food chain, we are only going to have 10% of the energy be transferred from level to level. The vast majority, 90% approximately of the energy consumed is lost. So we could say, and I'm making these numbers up right now, approximately 45% is lost to cellular respiration, and 45% is lost to death, excretion, and defecation. So, help me out here. If a fungus is consuming dead plant matter, would that fungus be considered an omnivore, herbivore, detritus feeder, autotroph, or carnivore? And I had to specify consuming dead plant matter because some fungi consume living organisms. I didn't want to deal with those fungi. So what do we call a fungus that's eating or consuming dead matter? That is correct, Ashley. C, a detritus feeder. What is another name for the detritus feeder? A decomposer. So let's move on and talk about how we can have energy moving throughout our ecosystem. We are going to have some energy flow. Actually, I should pause this right now and end this recording because it's getting kind of long.